The Further Education of OverSoul 7 by Jane Roberts, published 1979. Read by Martin John. Dedicated to the gods behind the divine camouflage. This book is written in the time of Geoffrey, circa late 1970s AD. Prologue 1 and then Prologue 2. Prologue 1. Cyprus said, "This is how the book will begin." Lydia was nicknamed Tweety because Bianca said she was tiny and skinny as a newborn bird. "Wait a second," OverSoul 7 said. "I think your tenses are wrong. Even though Lydia died in the 20th century and is reborn in the 17th, shouldn't you say Lydia will be called Tweety because she hasn't experienced that life yet? Or is it Lydia was called Tweety correct because people think that the 17th century happened first?" Or they both burst out laughing. Cyprus said, "You'll just have to wait and see. That is, though all time is simultaneous, I'll have to wait until writing the book catches up with my experience." Prologue 2, sometime later. "You are going to write this book, aren't you?" OverSoul 7 asked, somewhat anxiously. "In a matter of speaking," Cyprus said. "I think the first part will be called The Odyssey of Geoffrey Boy, Ram, and Queen Alice." "Who on earth are they?" OverSoul 7 asked. "And what do they have to do with Tweety and her new life and my further education?" Cyprus smiled. "That's something you'll have to learn for yourself. Real education always involves surprises. But pay attention now. The Odyssey of Geoffrey Boy, Ram, and Queen Alice is about to begin. Of course, Geoffrey Boy doesn't realize what's happening yet." The Further Education of OverSoul 7 by Jane Roberts, read by Martin John, Chapter 1. Journal of a Surprised Psychologist, Geoffrey W. Blodgett. These notes contain a record of my dream activities. Hardly the word for them. No, to be correct, this manuscript is a chronicle of journeys embarked upon, strange as it sounds, when my physical body sleeps. There are several points to be made, and I will make them here, with my first long entry. To be honest, I write that last statement with painful acceptance of general limitations that I, for one, no longer accept. For I know beyond all doubt, as you will see, that there is no past, present, or future in usual terms. Granting that, from now on, I'll keep this journal as up-to-date as possible, and I have the oddest sensation that something important is about to happen even before I have time to sketch in what has occurred thus far. Theoretically, these notes could be discovered in the past, even before I write them in my present. For that matter, they could come to light in some reality of which I know nothing. They could even emerge, as I know, as automatic writing on the part of some stranger who lets down the conscious barriers of his mind, appearing as psychological apports of a kind, even as I may appear a wanderer in your dreams, or you in mine. It seems that I've come alive only in these past few months. Yet when these events first began, I was staggered. Even now, at times, I doubt my sanity. Yet what has happened so far has given me glimpses into the undersides of reality, and these only make the topsides that much more miraculous. For the record, let me state that I've taken no drugs of any kind. Nothing that I know of initiated the adventure in which I am now involved. These notes, written in the daytime, represent my attempt to relate my activities in dimensions of which most people are completely unaware. So far, I've managed to return to normal daytime living, but I have no guarantee that this will always be the case, particularly since I've encountered difficulties at times of a certain undefinable nature. Again, so far, I've retained my normal consciousness stance in the reality accepted by everyone else, but I do grow aware of a precarious balance. As long as I write these notes and read those that I've written before, then I'll know that I've returned safely from those equally valid realms. If I decide not to return, then I'll record my decision here, so that anyone interested will know that my exodus was voluntary, not the result of coercion, or worse, error or carelessness on my part. Particularly if my ex-wife, Sarah, ever reads these notes. I wouldn't want her to imagine me trying to claw my way back from the underside of reality that she could not understand. Perhaps I should mention here that I'm a psychologist. My degrees alone would at least ensure that these notes get a reading. B.A. at Cornell's, Master's and Doctorate in Behavioral Psychology at Harvard. To those who still recognize such ludicrous badges of erudition, I say, hear me out. By your own standards, I have a right to your recognition. To those who think that degrees are primarily signs of ritualized ignorance, I say, I'm on your side. But I spent many years acquiring such status, and I may as well take advantage of it in that academia to which I no longer belong. I should tell you that I'm 36 years old and still partially distrust that part of me over 30. My ex-wife lives on the other side of the continent, remarried practically, if not legally, and pregnant with their first child. I was trying to make up my mind as to whether or not I wanted to grow a human being in this crazy garden of existence. Sarah, apparently, got tired of waiting and took up with another, more willing package of seed, so I was living alone when these events began. I'm convinced that I'm involved in work of the utmost importance. I'm also aware that my attitude has all the earmarks of egomania, or a good deal of them. But I'm not suffering from any kind of messiah complex. For one thing, I'm tired of examining myself for signs of schizophrenia, particularly since I've discovered what I'm used to regard as a normal state of consciousness represents only the surface ripples of my identity. For another thing, I'm using my own personality as a psychological guinea pig in my adventures, and part of my work necessitates playing around with different states of awareness. I hereby admit to those anticipated criticisms that my colleagues will make against me, that I'm not maintaining suitable objectivity or conforming to the, quote, scientific method. I'm even turning my back on the electroencephalograph and the now respectable, quote, dream laboratories, as they're called, though they have their place. Where I go, I must go utterly alone. No one can tell me what methods are useful or dangerous. The ordinary assumptions of daily life serve me not at all. Yet I will not turn back. The hope of great personal accomplishment and knowledge far outweighs the hazards, those that I have discovered and those that may still wait. So after this lengthy introduction, psychologists are notoriously long-winded. I'll record the events that led me to this pass. The first episode seems so insignificant, by contrast with my later activities, that my initial astonishment now seems almost amusing. Yet the first hole in physical reality opened for me that night. The first crack appeared in the ordinary existence that I'd always known. I was living in one of the wild stacks of modern apartments connected with the State University in a town in upstate New York. Each cube dwelling had its own entrance. The buildings had just been completed, and each terrace looked out on piles of rocks, dirt, and mud holes. The apartment itself reminded me of a Skinner box, complete with artificial environment, air conditioners, soundproofing, humidifiers, everything to make life sanitary and dull. I couldn't go to sleep that night, so I got out of bed and went into the living room. For a few moments I stood on the terrace. There were no stairs connecting it to the ground, and I was on the 7th floor. Across the way, identical terraces stuck out, hanging flimsily out over the snow-covered debris below. It was 2 a.m. when I came back inside, after having been on the terrace for perhaps 5 minutes. I checked the clock and threw myself down on the couch. Immediately I fell into a deep sleep and dreamed that 2 men were talking to me. They wore ordinary clothing, suits of some innocuous nature. We were discussing the failure of behavioral psychology to uncover any but the most surface qualities of human personality. I disagreed with their indictment. At this point, a terrific noise awakened me. I sprang to a sitting position, fully alert, and I must admit, instantly alarmed. To my astonishment, the 2 men still stood there. I recalled the dream clearly and recognized the 2 of them as my dream images. Blinking furiously, I rubbed my eyes. The wind knocked over the empty geranium pot on the patio. "Don't bother yourself," the first man said. I didn't speak, Quite deliberately I looked around. Everything was as it should be. The room was solid and real, except that the men couldn't possibly be in it. The sensory clues in that respect made no sense. There was one dim light, and I could see the men as clearly as I saw the couch, or desk, or anything else. I would have thought them intruders, burglars, if I hadn't remembered them from my dream. As reasonably as I could, I said, "Look, you're dream images. I can't possibly be talking to you because I'm wide awake, unless I'm still asleep and don't realize it." "You've been overworking, is that it?" The first man smiled in a way I found curiously comforting, and like an idiot I nodded my head vigorously and said, "Yes, that must be it. I'm still asleep and dreaming." But the second man laughed and didn't seem as well disposed towards me as the first. "Interesting hypothesis," he said. "Suppose I insist that you're a dream image of mine instead?" I scowled, but even then I noted my own reactions. This second man was somewhat younger than I, and I resented his manner of knowing, or pretending to know, more about the situation than I did. To make it worse, the other man then grinned indulgently and said, "On the other hand, you may both be images in a dream of mine." By now I knew that I was, indeed, fully awake, and I was frightened. For a moment I suspected that both of the men were lunatics who had somehow gained entry, intruders, in fact, and that I'd only confused them with earlier dream images. I pinched my arm. My reflexes were normal. My critical faculties were operating. Yet I could make no sense of the situation at all. The younger man said, "Now that we've provided you with suitable stimuli to your curiosity, we'll enjoy watching your further reactions." With this, I sprang up from the couch. Two things happened at once. Before my startled eyes, the intruders began to disappear, as if space itself was eating away at their edges. Then a severe, shattering click came at the base of my neck. The next thing I knew, I was back on the couch, thrown there in some fashion that utterly escaped me. The room was just as it had been, but the men were gone. Moreover, there was nothing to prove that they'd ever been there. Something else. I remembered opening my eyes, though I don't recall ever closing them. As soon as the men vanished, I ran to the French doors and threw them open. The geranium pot was in pieces on the patio floor. As the days passed, I convinced myself that the whole affair had been some kind of dream within a dream. Only one thing bothered me, my certainty that I had jumped up from the couch the moment the men's images were vanishing, while the next minute I was back on the couch with my eyes closed. If it were only a dream, why would I have thought my eyes opened or closed? I mean, usually in dreams you see what you see, and that's the end of it, or so I thought at the time. The clicking at the back of my neck was also difficult to explain away, but I decided it was caused by some spasmodic jerking of my muscles. I didn't tell anyone about the experience. Indeed, I managed to put it out of my mind so well that I might have forgotten it entirely if it hadn't been followed by an even more bizarre event. This next, more alarming, episode happened about a week later, and there was no way I could assign it to dream activity. As far as I can recall, this was the sequence of events. I was at my desk, concentrating on a student's paper. It was devoted to a discussion of some experiments we'd done on the frontal lobes of rats. Then, without transition, I was caught up in an experience of frightful intensity. First, my body felt as if it was expanding, yet growing lighter in weight. The process continued until I felt impossibly light. Miles of space seemed to exist between my ears. I became aware of the cells of my body in the oddest fashion. Each seemed to possess an alertness, a mini personality, eager, responsive, and individualistic, and most of all, each initiated action and didn't just respond to stimuli. I had some crazy idea that my consciousness had dropped back to its components, when suddenly I felt loose or unfixed. There was that same clicking sensation in the back of my neck again, and to my horror I found myself quite literally suspended in the air, outside the terrace, about 5 feet away from the railing, with nothing but some 60 feet of space between me and the ground. At any instant I expected to go crashing down, but nothing happened. I yelled for help, though there was no one in sight. It was late afternoon. I'd come home early to work on the student's report, but most people in the building were still in classes or meetings. In complete disbelief, I hung there, telling myself that it couldn't possibly be where I was, and wondering why I wasn't falling. It seemed that nothing was ever going to happen. No one would come to discover me, and I'd be left there for all eternity, like a fish on an invisible line, waiting to be pulled back in. Then, just as suddenly, I was back inside the living room, but still in the air, floating. Next, I changed position and got the next worst fright of my life, for I was staring down at my own body. There I sat, eyes closed, but pen in hand, as if I'd taken a catnap while reading. I looked down at the top of my head, each hair springing up merrily like red grass from my scalp. My shoulders were slumped. The familiarity and unfamiliarity, so intermixed, quite transfixed me. My body looked so weirdly forlorn that a heart-rending pity for it rushed through me. But how could I be outside my body, looking down at it? I'd hardly thought of the question when I was drawn back into my usual form so quickly that I closed my eyes, imagining The worst kind of crash landing. I'm not sure what happened next, except that the clicking sound came again, and with it a sound like a soft explosion. Almost beyond panic, I opened my eyes to see my fingers holding the pen. I was back in my body. But if I had just opened my eyes, what eyes had I closed just before I plunged back in? Dazed, I looked out the window to where I'd hung just a few moments earlier, and I had the disquieting fear that I might see myself still dangling there. That night, I knew I had to talk to someone. Only one person came to mind. Ramrod Braille, an older colleague who dabbled in fields like hypnosis and parapsychology. Now I wonder what would have happened if I'd chosen someone else to confide in instead. Certainly, in the next weeks, I wished more than once that I'd never made that phone call in Chapter 1. Peace, light, and love. Aloha.